Man finds stray cat, still alive in fire, his actions then move people. What if the fire that destroyed the Peterson home wasn't an accident, and the faint scar on Pumpkin's ear was actually a clue to something far more sinister lurking in the seemingly peaceful town of Harmony Creek? The carpenter's heroic act saved a cat, but it may have unknowingly brought him closer to a dangerous truth. Like, subscribe, and listen to find out if this tale of ashes and hope has a darker secret yet to be revealed. The heat radiating from the ruins was still intense enough to make the air shimmer. Arthur squinted, his eyes watering from the lingering smoke. The hollow beneath the charred rafters was small, a pocket of relative darkness in the otherwise exposed devastation. He'd seen a flicker of movement there, a tiny, almost imperceptible shift that could have been a trick of the dying light or the settling of debris. But something, a gut feeling honed by years of quiet observation, told him otherwise. He reached deeper, his arm disappearing into the smoky void. His fingers, calloused and strong from decades of woodworking, brushed against something soft, something warm, impossibly warm, given the inferno that had raged here just hours before. Then a faint, incredibly fragile vibration against his palm. A heartbeat. Carefully, painstakingly, Arthur worked his hand around the small form. It was limp, but undeniably alive. He drew it out into the dimming light. A small orange cat, its fur matted with soot and singed in patches, lay curled in his palm. Its eyes were closed, its tiny body trembling almost imperceptibly. One ear was scorched, and a thin trickle of blood oozed from a cut on its paw. It was so small, so vulnerable, a tiny ember of life amidst the ashes of destruction. A collective gasp went up from the remaining onlookers. Young Timmy Peterson, his face tear-streaked and smudged with ash, let out a choked cry. "Pumpkin!" he whispered, his voice barely audible, a fragile thread of hope in the overwhelming despair. But this cat was a stray, Arthur knew. He'd seen it slinking around the neighborhood, a nameless, feral creature, ignoring the murmurs, ignoring the sudden, intense focus on him. Arthur cradled the cat against his chest. Its breathing was shallow, ragged. He knew with a certainty that settled like lead in his stomach that it wouldn't survive long without help. The nearest emergency vet clinic was in Oak Haven, a good 20-minute drive, and it was already getting late. Without a word to anyone, Arthur turned and strode towards his old pickup truck parked down the street. His movements were urgent, his face set in a grim mask of determination. The crowd parted for him, their earlier shock now mixed with a dawning sense of awe and disbelief. A firefighter started to say something about the area still being unsafe, but fell silent as Arthur passed the unconscious orange cat, held like a precious, fragile treasure against his dusty workshirt. What was this quiet carpenter, a man known more for his solitude than for grand gestures, doing? And why this desperate, almost reckless effort for a common stray, a creature most would have written off as another casualty of the blaze? The questions hung in the smoky air as the taillights of Arthur's truck disappeared down Elm Street. Arthur Jenkins was a man etched by time and loss, much like the seasoned oak he favored for his custom furniture. At 67, he was a widower, his beloved Sarah having succumbed to a quiet illness 5 years prior, leaving their small house on the edge of Oak Haven, feeling vast and empty. He was a carpenter by trade, a master craftsman whose hands could coax beauty and utility from raw timber. His workshop attached to his house was his sanctuary filled with the scent of sawdust varnish and the quiet companionship of his tools. He was a man of few words, his interactions with the townsfolk polite but reserved. Most knew him as a reliable, skilled artisan, but few knew the depth of quiet sorrow or the steadfast loyalty that lay beneath his stoic exterior. The Peterson family, whose house had just burned, lived 3 streets over. Arthur knew them by sight, as one knows most people in a town the size of Harmony Creek. He'd even built a custom bookshelf for their son Timmy a few years back, a sturdy, unpretentious piece designed to hold a boy's treasures. The news of the fire had reached him via the wail of sirens earlier that afternoon, a sound that always sent a chill down his spine, a visceral reminder of the fragility of things. He hadn't rushed to the scene like some drawn by a morbid curiosity. Instead, he'd felt a familiar ache, a sense of helplessness. He understood loss the way a home could be violated, the way cherished possessions could turn to ash. It was only later, as the worst seemed over and the emergency vehicles began to disperse, that a quiet compulsion had drawn him towards Elm Street. He'd told himself he was just going to see if there was anything a neighbor could do, offer a silent show of support. The inciting incident wasn't a grand decision, but a series of small, almost subconscious observations. Standing at the periphery of the devastation, watching the heartbroken Petersons, he'd seen the small orange stray cat dart out from under a bush across the street, look towards the smoldering house with an almost human-like distress, then disappear back into the shadows. He'd seen that cat around before, a skittish creature always keeping its distance. He'd even left out scraps for it occasionally, a habit Sarah had started. Then, as he moved closer to the cordoned-off area drawn by an instinct he couldn't name, he'd seen that flicker of movement within the collapsed section of the roof. The official search by the firefighters had concluded. They were focused on hot spots and ensuring the scene was secure. No one was looking for animal survivors, especially not strays. But Arthur had seen the cat earlier, its strange focus on the burning house, and now this almost imperceptible sign of life. His choice to step into the dangerous ruins was not born of recklessness, but of a deep-seated empathy, a refusal to let even the smallest life be extinguished without a fight, if he could help it. It was the same instinct that made him meticulously mend a broken chair leg rather than discard it, the same patience that allowed him to coax a perfect finish from stubborn wood life in any form was precious. And this tiny creature, trapped and dying, represented a spark that deserved a chance. His initial goal was simple, primal: to rescue, to bring that flicker of life out of the darkness and into the possibility of survival. The cost, the danger to himself, the reactions of others, those were secondary thoughts. If they occurred to him at all in that moment of focused action, he just knew he had to try. The drive to the Oak Haven Emergency Veterinary Clinic was a blur of focused urgency. Arthur had wrapped the small limp cat in his own flannel overshirt, creating a warm, soft nest on the passenger seat. He drove carefully but swiftly, one hand on the wheel, the other hovering near the cat, feeling for the faint rise and fall of its chest. Each shallow breath was a small victory. He arrived at the clinic, a modern, brightly lit building that seemed out of place in the quiet, late evening. He rushed in, the bundled cat in his arms, his appearance, soot-streaked face, dusty clothes, intense eyes, clearly alarming the young woman at the reception desk. I found him in a house fire. Arthur stated, his voice raspy from the smoke he'd inadvertently inhaled. "He's barely breathing." The receptionist, to her credit, reacted quickly. A veterinary technician was summoned, and the cat was whisked away to an examination room. Arthur was left in the sterile waiting area, the scent of antiseptic sharp in his nostrils, a stark contrast to the acrid smoke that still clung to him. He filled out the necessary paperwork, his large calloused hands fumbling with the pen under Pet's name. He hesitated, then wrote, "Ember." It seemed fitting. Under owner's name. He wrote his own Dr. Evans. A young, competent-looking veterinarian emerged after what felt like an eternity. Her expression was serious. "Mr. Jenkins," she began, "Ember is in critical condition. He has severe smoke inhalation, burns on his paws and one ear, and he's suffering from shock and dehydration. We've started him on oxygen and fluids, and we're treating his burns. The next 24 hours will be crucial." Arthur listened, his face impassive, but his knuckles were white, where he gripped the edge of the counter. Will he make it?" Dr. Evans met his gaze. "Honestly, it's too soon to tell. He's a fighter, I can see that. But the smoke inhalation is our biggest concern right now. The internal damage can be extensive." She then broached the inevitable topic. "The initial treatment, including the oxygen therapy and emergency care, will be substantial. Are you prepared to cover the costs?" Arthur didn't hesitate. Whatever it takes, he knew his savings weren't vast. Sarah's illness had depleted much of them, but the thought of abandoning this small creature now was inconceivable. He authorized the treatment, the sum making his stomach clench, but his resolve firm. He wasn't allowed to see Ember that night. The clinic advised him to go home, get some rest, and call in the morning. The drive back to Harmony Creek was long and quiet. His small house felt even emptier than usual. He showered the water running black with soot, but he couldn't wash away the image of Ember's fragile body, the memory of that faint heartbeat. The next morning, he called the clinic at dawn. Ember had survived the night, but was still critical. Arthur drove back to Oak Haven. He spent hours in the waiting room, a silent, anxious sentinel. He brought a small, soft blanket from home, one of Sarah's old favorites, hoping its familiar scent might offer some comfort if Ember was ever well enough to notice. The days that followed fell into a new, exhausting routine. Morning calls to the clinic, then the drive to Oak Haven. He'd sit by Ember's incubator in the ICU when aloud, speaking softly to the unconscious cat, telling him about the workshop, the smell of cedar, the way the sunlight fell through the window. In the late afternoon, he wasn't sure if Ember could hear him or if he was just talking to soothe his own anxieties. The vet bills were mounting, each one a fresh wave of worry. But Arthur paid them without complaint, liquidating a small emergency fund he'd kept tucked away. News of his actions had begun to filter through Harmony Creek. Some thought him a quiet hero. Others, more pragmatic, whispered he was a fool, spending his hard-earned money on a stray cat, when the Peterson family, who had lost everything, desperately needed help. Arthur ignored the talk. His focus was singular. Ember's condition fluctuated. There were small improvements, a stronger heartbeat, a slight response to touch, followed by setbacks, a persistent cough, a worrying fever. Dr. Evans and her team were dedicated, but the odds were still stacked against the little cat. Arthur found an unexpected ally in a young vet tech named Maria, who had a soft spot for strays and seemed particularly invested in Ember's recovery. She would give Arthur candid updates, her empathy a small comfort. The greatest complication, however, was not financial or medical, but emotional. Arthur found himself becoming deeply attached to this small fighting spirit. He hadn't realized how much he'd closed himself off since Sarah's death, how much he'd missed having someone to care for so intensely. Ember, in his fragility, was reawakening parts of Arthur's heart he thought had gone dormant forever. The stakes were no longer just about saving a life. They were about Arthur's own capacity for hope and connection in the face of potential loss. After nearly a week of intensive care, a week that felt like a lifetime, to Arthur, Dr. Evans delivered news that was cautiously optimistic. Embers turned a corner. Arthur, she said, using his first name for the first time, a small sign of the rapport that had developed between them. The worst of the lung inflammation is subsiding. He's breathing on his own without the oxygen tent for longer periods. He even ate a little bit of soft food this morning. Relief, so potent it was almost dizzying, washed over Arthur. He was finally allowed to hold Ember, albeit briefly. The cat was still weak, his fur patchy, his burns bandaged, but he was undeniably alive, his small body warm against Arthur's chest. Ember even managed a faint, raspy purr, a sound that resonated deep within Arthur's soul. A few days later, Ember was deemed stable enough to be discharged, though he would require significant ongoing care medication, special food, regular checkups, and careful monitoring. The final bill from the emergency clinic was staggering, wiping out the last of Arthur's accessible savings. He paid it without a word, his only concern, getting Ember home. He converted a corner of his quiet living room into a recovery area for Ember. With the soft blanket Sarah had loved, a low-sided litter box, and bowls of fresh water, and the prescribed food. The first few days at home were challenging. Ember was still very frail, sleeping most of the time, and needed medication administered several times a day. Arthur, despite his large carpenter's hands, proved surprisingly adept at gently pilling the cat and applying salve to his healing burns. He moved his own armchair closer to Ember's bed, spending his evenings reading aloud from old woodworking journals, the quiet cadence of his voice seeming to soothe the little cat. The solitude of his house was different, now punctuated by Ember's soft breathing, the occasional tentative meow. The small routines of care. Arthur found himself talking to Ember, constantly recounting his day in the workshop, sharing memories of Sarah, who had always loved animals. He was no longer just reacting to a crisis. He was actively nurturing, building a bond with this small creature he had pulled from the ashes. One afternoon, about a week after Ember came home, Mrs. Henderson, Arthur's next-door neighbor, a kind, grandmotherly woman, stopped by with a freshly baked apple pie. She'd heard about Arthur's rescue and wanted to check in. As she chatted with Arthur in the living room, her gaze fell upon Ember, who was cautiously exploring a patch of sunlight on the rug. "Oh, Arthur, he's a little miracle, isn't he?" Mrs. Henderson said softly, her eyes warm. She leaned closer for a better look. Ember surprisingly didn't shy away, but looked up at her with wide, curious green eyes. Such a beautiful orange, what's left of his fur, and those ears. Her voice trailed off, and her brow furrowed slightly. That little nick on his left ear, it looks almost like a tiny scar, doesn't it? Arthur hadn't paid much attention to it before, focusing more on the burns. But now, looking closely, he saw what she meant. A very faint, thin white line, almost hidden by the new fur beginning to grow back. It didn't look like a recent injury from the fire. Mrs. Henderson suddenly gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Her eyes, wide with disbelief, darted from the cat to Arthur. "Arthur," she whispered, her voice trembling, "that scar, I've seen it before. My sister, Margaret Peterson, her grandson, Timmy, he had an orange cat. Pumpkin got that exact same scar last summer when he got into a tussle with a raccoon. They thought Pumpkin died in the fire. Timmy is heartbroken, utterly devastated. He won't stop crying for his cat." Arthur stared at Ember, then at Mrs. Henderson, his mind reeling. Pumpkin, Timmy Peterson's cat. He remembered the boy's choked whisper at the fire scene. He had dismissed it, assuming it was just a child's desperate hope. But the scar, this revelation was a profound turning point. Ember wasn't just a stray he had saved. He was a beloved pet, a missing piece of a shattered family's life. Arthur's role instantly shifted. He was no longer just a rescuer and caregiver. He was now the custodian of a child's lost hope. The decision he had to make was clear, yet incredibly difficult. He had grown to love this little cat, had poured his heart, his savings, his very soul into saving him. Ember had become a fixture in his quiet life, a balm to his loneliness. But if Ember was truly Timmy's Pumpkin, he couldn't keep him. The point of no return had been reached. He had to find out the truth, and if it was confirmed, he had to do the right thing, no matter how much it hurt. The weight of Mrs. Henderson's revelation settled heavily on Arthur. He spent a restless night, Ember purring softly beside him on Sarah's old blanket, oblivious to the turmoil in Arthur's heart. Could it be true? The scar was faint, and orange cats with nicks in their ears weren't unheard of. But Mrs. Henderson had seemed so certain, her reaction so visceral. The next morning, Arthur knew he couldn't delay. He had to speak to the Petersons. The thought filled him with a mixture of dread and a strange sort of resolve. He found their temporary address. They were staying with Margaret Peterson, Mrs. Henderson's sister, on the other side of town. He carefully placed Ember in the pet carrier, a new one he'd bought along with a supply of his special food. The cat meowed in protest, not understanding the change in routine. "It's all right, little one," Arthur murmured, his voice thick. "We just need to check on something." The drive to Margaret Peterson's house was filled with a quiet tension. When he arrived, Mrs. Henderson was there, having clearly alerted her sister. Margaret greeted him at the door, her eyes searching his face, then looking at the carrier. "Arthur," she said softly, "thank you for coming. Helen told me about the scar." They sat in the living room, a space filled with the borrowed comforts of a temporary home. Young Timmy Peterson, a boy of about 8, with wide, sad eyes and tear tracks still visible on his cheeks, sat listlessly on the sofa, clutching a soot-stained stuffed dog. His parents, Tom and Susan Peterson, looked worn down by grief and the overwhelming stress of losing their home. Arthur placed the carrier on the floor and opened the door. Ember, after a moment's hesitation, stepped out cautiously, his gaze sweeping the unfamiliar room. He was still thin, his fur patchy, the burns on his paws still tender, but he moved with a newfound, albeit shaky, confidence. Timmy looked up. His eyes, dull with sorrow, flickered with a spark of something unreadable as he saw the orange cat. He didn't move, didn't speak. "Timmy," Margaret said gently, "this is Mr. Jenkins. He rescued this cat from the fire." Arthur watched the boy, his heart aching. "His name is Ember," right now," Arthur said, his voice quiet. "He was hurt pretty badly, but he's getting better." He then looked at Tom and Susan. "Mrs. Henderson, Helen mentioned a scar on your cat Pumpkin's ear." Susan Peterson nodded, tears welling in her eyes. "Yes, a little white line on his left ear. From when he got into a fight with that raccoon in the woods behind our house last year, Timmy was so worried about him." Then Arthur gently picked up Ember, turning him so his left ear was visible. Is this it?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. Timmy slowly slid off the sofa and approached his parents, watching anxiously. He peered at Ember's ear, his small face intent. He reached out a tentative finger and gently touched the faint white line. Ember, instead of flinching from the unfamiliar touch, leaned into it, and then, to everyone's astonishment, let out a loud rumbling purr and rubbed his head against Timmy's hand. Timmy's eyes widened. A choked sob escaped him. "Pumpkin!" he whispered, his voice trembling. "Pumpkin, is that you?" He looked up at Arthur, his eyes shining with a desperate, burgeoning hope. It looks like his scar, and he never purrs like that for strangers." The evidence was compelling, almost undeniable. The scar. The cat's reaction to Timmy Arthur felt a pang, sharp and deep. This was it. This was Pumpkin. The challenges now were immense, though different from before. The emotional cost of giving up Ember after all they'd been through was a heavy blow. He saw the hope in Timmy's eyes, the relief on his parents' faces, and knew there was only one right thing to do. But it didn't make it any easier. He spent the next hour with the Petersons, recounting Ember's rescue, his fight for survival at the vet clinic, his recovery at Arthur's home. He showed them the medications, explained the feeding schedule, the ongoing care Ember, Pumpkin, would need. The Petersons were overwhelmed, tears of gratitude streaming down their faces. They had assumed their beloved pet was lost forever. Another tragic casualty of the fire. Tom Peterson gripped Arthur's hand. "Mr. Jenkins, Arthur, I don't know how we can ever repay you, not just for saving him, but for the cost. We lost everything. We have insurance, but it'll take time." "Don't you worry about that," Arthur said, waving off the concern, though the thought of his depleted savings was a dull ache. "The only thing that matters is that he's home." As Arthur prepared to leave without Ember, the little cat now curled contentedly in Timmy's lap. A profound sense of loss washed over him. His house would be quiet again, too quiet. This was his dark night of the soul. He had done the right thing, the only thing he could do, but the sacrifice was immense. He had saved a life, rekindled a child's hope, but in doing so, he had to let go of a companion who had in a short time filled a significant void in his own life. The final preparations for the climax were not about a confrontation, but about this act of selfless love and the emotional reckoning that came with it. A week later, a small article appeared in the Harmony Creek Herald, penned by a local freelance writer who had heard whispers of the story. It was titled "The Carpenter and the Phoenix Cat." It didn't name Arthur directly, at first referring to him only as a quiet local craftsman, but it detailed the dramatic rescue of an orange cat from the Peterson fire, its miraculous survival against the odds, and its eventual joyous reunion with a heartbroken little boy, all thanks to the rescuer's unwavering dedication and generosity. The article mentioned the significant vet bills and the ongoing care the cat, now identified as Pumpkin, would require. The story struck a chord in Harmony Creek. In a town that had recently witnessed such devastating loss, this tale of quiet heroism and improbable survival was a beacon of hope. People began to talk. Mrs. Henderson, never one to be shy, filled in the details, proudly naming Arthur Jenkins as the hero. The following Saturday, Arthur was in his workshop trying to lose himself in the familiar rhythm of planing a piece of maple. The silence of the space more pronounced than ever when he heard a commotion outside. He stepped out to see a small crowd gathered at the end of his driveway. Tom and Susan Peterson were there with Timmy, holding a now much healthier-looking pumpkin in his arms. Dr. Evans from the Oak Haven Clinic was present, as was Maria, the vet tech. Mrs. Henderson stood beaming alongside several other neighbors Arthur recognized. Even the young freelance writer was there, notepad in hand. Tom Peterson stepped forward, clearing his throat. "Arthur," he began, his voice thick with emotion, "we, the town, we read the story, we heard what you did. Not just pulling pumpkin from that hell, but everything afterwards. The clinic told us about the bills you paid without a second thought." He gestured to a large jar held by Timmy, filled to the brim with cash and checks. "Harmony Creek wanted to say thank you. This is for Pumpkin's ongoing care and to help you recoup what you spent. It's not just from us, it's from everyone whose heart you touched." Arthur was stunned, speechless. He looked at the faces in the crowd, at their genuine smiles, their expressions of admiration. He saw Timmy, his eyes shining, no longer filled with sadness, but with pure joy as he hugged his cat. Pumpkin looked up, caught Arthur's eye, and let out a distinct, happy meow. Dr. Evans stepped up. "Arthur, your compassion saved this little guy. You reminded all of us what really matters." Maria handed him a framed photo of Ember Pumpkin taken at the clinic during his recovery, a small bandaged paw raised as if in a wave. The central question of Arthur's journey, whether his quiet, solitary efforts would ultimately lead to more heartbreak or to a meaningful resolution, was answered not in a dramatic confrontation, but in this outpouring of community gratitude and recognition. His selfless actions, born from a deep well of empathy, had rippled outwards, inspiring others, mending a small piece of a broken world. He hadn't sought recognition, had expected nothing in return, but here it was a testament to the power of one man's quiet courage. The town, moved by his sacrifice, was giving back not just financially, but with an affirmation of shared humanity. Arthur, overwhelmed and deeply moved, could only manage a few heartfelt words of thanks. The fund collected by the town more than covered Pumpkin's past and future medical expenses, with enough left over to significantly replenish Arthur's savings. But more valuable than the money was the warmth of the community's embrace. In the weeks that followed, Arthur's life subtly changed. He was still the quiet carpenter, but the wall of reserve around him had softened. Neighbors stopped by more often, not just for woodworking projects, but to chat, to share a cup of coffee. He found himself accepting invitations, attending the town's fall festival for the first time in years. He saw the Petersons regularly. Timmy, with Pumpkin often in tow, now fully recovered, his orange fur gleaming, would visit Arthur's workshop, fascinated by the tools and the smell of wood. Arthur started teaching the boys some simple woodworking skills, carving small animal figures. Pumpkin would often nap in a patch of sunlight on a pile of cedar shavings, a comfortable purring presence. Arthur didn't get another cat immediately. The space Ember Pumpkin had filled was unique, but his house no longer felt quite so empty. The memory of those intense weeks, the fight for that small life, had reawakened something in him. He volunteered some of his time at the local animal shelter, helping to repair cages and build scratching posts, his skilled hands finding new purpose. The story of Arthur and Pumpkin became a cherished local legend, a reminder that even in the face of tragedy, acts of kindness, however small they might seem, can have a profound impact. Arthur Jenkins, the quiet man who had walked into a ruin to save a spark of life, had not only rescued a cat, but had also, in a way, rescued a piece of his own heart and ignited a spirit of compassion in his community. His new normal was one of greater connection, purpose, and the quiet satisfaction of knowing that his actions had truly mattered, proving that even in the ashes of loss, hope and humanity could indeed shine brightly. Next to the old well, there is always the silhouette of an orange cat there. When people look inside, they can't believe their eyes. Deep in the rolling hills of rural Pennsylvania lay the village of Harmony Creek. It was a place where time seemed to move a little slower, where roots ran deep, and where most families had known each other for generations. Fields of corn and soy stretched between patches of dense woodland, and the creek itself, the village's namesake, meandered gently through the landscape. But like many old places, Harmony Creek held its share of shadows and unspoken histories. One such shadow lay heavy around the old fieldstone well situated near the edge of Black Creek Woods, not far from a dilapidated, long-abandoned farmhouse. The well hadn't drawn water in decades. Its stone structure was crumbling in places, overgrown with tenacious ivy and moss. A heavy, rotting wooden cover lay askew over the opening, warped by years of rain and snow, leaving dark gaps that seemed to swallow the light. Locals avoided it. Children were warned away with hushed tones and vague tales. The older generation remembered the stories more clearly. Whispers about young David Palmer, who had lived in the nearby farmhouse and vanished without a trace some 20 years ago. Some said he'd simply run off, seeking fortune elsewhere, but darker rumors hinted he'd met foul play, perhaps even ending up in the cold, dark depths of that very well. The farmhouse stood empty, slowly surrendering to the elements, a silent monument to his disappearance. The well remained a place of unease, a dark punctuation mark at the edge of the familiar woods. Life in Harmony Creek continued its steady pace, the old well largely forgotten in the routines of daily living. Until the cat appeared. He was an orange tabby, not quite young but not yet truly old, with fur the color of faded autumn leaves and intelligent green eyes. No one knew where he came from. Strays weren't uncommon, often drawn to the barns and back porches of the village. But this one was different. He seemed singularly focused on the abandoned well. He was first noticed by folks whose properties bordered the woods, a flash of orange darting through the underbrush near the well site. Then his behavior grew more specific, more unsettling. As dusk settled, casting long, eerie shadows through the trees, the cat would materialize near the crumbling stones. He wouldn't just sit, he would pace, circle the well, and emit low, mournful cries that carried on the still evening air. Sometimes he would rear up on his hind legs and scratch frantically at the heavy, decaying wooden cover, his claws making rasping sounds against the damp wood as if desperately trying to get in or let something out. At first, people dismissed it. Just a stray yowling, some said. Probably smells a mouse under that cover, offered others. But the cat's persistence, his nightly ritual performed with such focused intensity, began to gnaw at the edges of the village's composure. His cries sounded less like hunger and more like grief, like a desperate, unheard alarm. The shadow by the stones was no longer just the well. It was the well, and the strange, sorrowful orange cat who kept its lonely, unsettling vigil. Arthur Pendleton had lived in Harmony Creek his entire 72 years. His small, tidy house stood on the edge of the village, its back garden bordering the woods, where the old Palmer place and the abandoned well lay hidden from the main road. He was a retired school teacher, a widower, living a quiet life punctuated by gardening, reading, and occasional chats with neighbors over the fence. He remembered David Palmer, a quiet, artistic boy who had been a student in his class many years ago. He also remembered David's best friend, Samuel Bishop, a more outgoing, robust boy who still lived in Harmony Creek, now a respected local businessman. Arthur had been fond of both boys, though their paths had diverged significantly after David's vanishing. It was Arthur who first truly registered the orange cat's strange behavior as more than just random stray activity. His bedroom window faced the woods, and the cat's nightly cries, carried on the quiet air, began to disturb his sleep. He'd see the flash of orange near the well when he took his evening constitutional along the edge of his property. He noticed the specificity of the cat's actions, the pacing, the crying directed at the well, the persistent scratching on the heavy cover. "Strange cat," he muttered to himself one evening, watching the feline silhouette against the deepening twilight. "What in the world are you so worked up about over there?" He felt a prickle of the old unease associated with the well. David's disappearance had been a sad, baffling affair. Arthur had never fully believed the boy had just run off without a word. He'd seemed content, if quiet, rooted in Harmony Creek despite his artistic inclinations. Days turned into weeks, and the cat, which Arthur began to think of as Ginger, showed no sign of leaving. If anything, his cries grew more insistent, more mournful. Arthur started leaving a saucer of milk on his back step, which was always empty by morning, but it didn't seem to appease the cat or alter his nightly ritual at the well. One particularly still, humid evening in late summer, the cat's cries sounded especially distressed. Arthur stood at his window, listening, a growing sense of disquiet settling over him. It wasn't just annoyance anymore. It felt wrong. That cat wasn't crazy. It was fixated, driven by something. The old rumors about the well surfaced in his mind, mingling with the cat's haunting sounds. "This is foolishness, Arthur," he told himself sternly. "It's a cat, an old well, and too much imagination." But the image of the cat scratching desperately at the cover wouldn't leave him. What if there was something down there, a trapped animal, or something else? The thought sent a shiver down his spine despite the warm night. He found himself pulling on his old work boots and grabbing a sturdy flashlight from the kitchen drawer. He also took a crowbar from the shed, not with any specific intent, just a feeling that if he was going to investigate that heavy, rotten cover, He might need some leverage. Just going to take a look, he mumbled, trying to convince himself as he stepped out into the twilight and headed towards the woods, towards the crumbling stone well and the insistent crying cat. Just satisfy my curiosity, put the foolishness to rest. But deep down, a cold knot of dread tightened in his stomach. He felt he was walking toward something he might regret discovering. The air grew heavier, cooler, as Arthur pushed through the overgrown path leading towards the old Palmer place. The trees dripped with humidity, and the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves filled his nostrils. Ahead, he could hear the cat's cries, closer now, more distinct, a truly sorrowful sound. And then he saw him, the orange tabby, Leo, pacing frantically around the well's edge, pausing only to scratch vigorously at the dark, warped wood of the cover. "Easy there, fella," Arthur said softly, his voice raspy. The cat stopped instantly, whirling around, eyes wide and luminous in the beam of Arthur's flashlight. He didn't bolt, but stood frozen, watching Arthur approach, a low growl rumbling in his chest. Arthur stopped a few feet away, keeping the light steady. "It's all right. Just came to see what all the fuss is about." He shone the light onto the well cover. It was thick, made of heavy planks, dark with moisture and age. Moss grew in the cracks, and one corner had crumbled away. It sat unevenly on the stone lip, leaving definite gaps. The area where the cat had been scratching was splintered and scored with claw marks. A faint, unpleasant odor seemed to seep from the gaps in the cover, damp, earthy, with an underlying hint of something else, something sickly sweet and decayed. Arthur's dread intensified. He approached the edge, planting his feet firmly. He hesitated, then wedged the tip of the crowbar into a crack near the edge where the wood looked weakest. "Okay, Ginger," he muttered, more to himself than the cat. "Let's see what has you so upset." He put his weight into the crowbar. The wood groaned in protest, resisting for a moment before giving way with a splintering crack. Arthur grunted with the effort, leveraging a section of the cover upwards. The odor immediately intensified, washing over him, foul and suffocating. He gagged, stumbling back a step, his flashlight beam wavering. The cat let out a sharp hiss, but didn't run. It stared intently at the newly widened opening. Taking deep breaths of the less foul air away from the direct opening, Arthur steeled himself and approached again, shining the powerful flashlight beam down into the darkness. The beam cut through the blackness, illuminating the rough stone walls of the well shaft, slick with moisture. It traveled downwards, revealing a tangle of debris at the bottom, fallen leaves, branches, rocks, and something else. Arthur's breath caught in his throat. His blood ran cold. Partially buried beneath the debris, unmistakable even in their decayed state, were human bones, a skull, ribs, the long bones of limbs, scattered and broken, lying in the mud and decay at the bottom of the well. Beside the main cluster of bones lay a dark, rectangular shape, half submerged in stagnant water, a small wooden box, its surface rotten and crumbling. Arthur felt his legs tremble. He couldn't breathe, couldn't think. Bile rose in his throat. It wasn't a trapped animal. The old rumors, the dark whispers, they were true. Someone was down there. Someone had been down there for a very, very long time. He backed away from the well, stumbling over roots, his heart pounding against his ribs like a trapped bird. He turned and ran, crashing through the underbrush, heedless of the branches whipping at his face. He didn't stop until he burst out of the woods and into the relative safety of his own backyard. Gasping for air, the horrifying image burned into his mind. He fumbled for his phone, his fingers shaking uncontrollably. He needed to call the sheriff. He needed to tell someone what he'd found. The cat's vigil suddenly made a terrible, chilling kind of sense. It hadn't been crying for nothing. It had been standing guard over a grave. Sheriff Brody arrived with 2 deputies within 15 minutes. Sirens off as they pulled up Arthur's driveway, their headlights cutting swathes through the darkness. Arthur, pale and still shaking, met them on his porch, stumbling over his words as he explained about the cat, the noise, the well cover, and the horrifying discovery. Sheriff Brody, a sturdy man who had known Harmony Creek and its inhabitants his whole life, listened grimly. He knew the rumors surrounding the well and David Palmer's disappearance. He'd always hoped the boy had just sought a different life, but Arthur's terrified certainty spoke volumes. Leaving one deputy with Arthur, Brody and the other followed Arthur's path back through the woods, their powerful flashlights piercing the oppressive darkness. The orange cat was still there, sitting a few yards away from the well now, watching silently as they approached the disturbed cover. The foul stench confirmed Arthur's story before they even looked inside. Brody shone his light down. "Lord, have mercy," he breathed, seeing the scattered bones in the box. He immediately secured the area, ordering his deputy to keep watch and allow no one near while he called the county coroner and the state police forensic team. This was no longer a missing person case. It was a homicide investigation, decades old. Word travels fast in a small town. By dawn, even with the sheriff trying to keep things contained, whispers were spreading like wildfire through Harmony Creek. The old Palmer well. Human remains found. David Palmer. The name was on everyone's lips, spoken with a mixture of shock, sadness, and morbid curiosity. The forensic team arrived and spent hours meticulously documenting the scene and recovering the fragile remains and the sodden wooden box from the well's depths. Arthur, watching from a distance allowed by the sheriff, felt numb. Seeing the careful excavation made it horribly real. Among the first people Sheriff Brody notified officially was Samuel Bishop. As David Palmer's childhood best friend and one of the last people known to have seen him before he vanished, Samuel's input was crucial. Brody found him at the successful construction business he owned on the outskirts of town. Samuel, now in his early 50s, still robust but showing lines of stress around his eyes, listened to the sheriff's grim news with widening eyes. He sank heavily into his office chair. "David," he stammered, his face paling. "They found in the well after all this time?" He shook his head, running a hand over his face. "My God, I always hoped he'd just gone off somewhere, made a new life." Tears welled in his eyes. Poor David, to end up like that. His grief seemed genuine, profound. He recounted what little he knew about David's last days. David had been restless, talking about maybe selling the old farmhouse and traveling, using the inheritance money he'd received. They'd had a minor disagreement about it. Samuel thought he was being foolish, but nothing serious. He'd last seen David packing some things a couple of days before he officially vanished. Samuel offered his full cooperation, his voice thick with emotion. Arthur heard later about Samuel's reaction. It seemed appropriate, the shock and sorrow of a man learning his long-lost friend had met a terrible end. Arthur himself felt a deep, aching grief, not just for the quiet boy he remembered, but for the years lost, the unanswered questions now given a horrifying answer. The preliminary forensic report confirmed the remains were male, consistent with David Palmer's age at the time of his disappearance. Dental records, retrieved from old family files, provided a positive identification. It was David. Harmony Creek mourned. An impromptu memorial service was planned. But amidst the grief, questions lingered. How did David end up in the well? Was it an accident? Or had the darkest rumors been true all along? And through it all, the orange cat maintained its presence. It no longer cried or scratched, but it could often be seen sitting near the police tape cordoning off the well, watching the proceedings with unsettling stillness, a silent orange ghost tied to a decades-old tragedy. The investigation intensified. The forensic team carefully examined the recovered bones, searching for any sign of trauma that might indicate foul play. Meanwhile, detectives focused on the sodden wooden box found alongside David's remains. After careful drying and preservation, they were able to open it. Inside, cushioned by what looked like rotted fabric, were a few precious items: a small leather-bound notebook, a handful of charcoal sketching pencils, and a small faded black and white photograph. The photo showed two young men, teenagers, arms slung around each other's shoulders, grinning proudly beside a large fish one of them held up. Arthur, when shown the photo, identified them immediately: David Palmer and Samuel Bishop, young and inseparable, full of life. The sight brought fresh tears to his eyes. The notebook proved more revealing. It was David's journal and sketchbook. Many pages contained detailed drawings of the local landscape, birds, and architectural details of Harmony Creek. But interspersed with the art were written entries. Towards the end, the tone shifted. David wrote about feeling restless, about wanting to see more of the world beyond Harmony Creek. He mentioned selling the farmhouse and using his inheritance to travel, perhaps study art. Seriously. Then came the entries that made the detectives pause. David wrote about arguing with Samuel over his plans. "Sam doesn't get it," one entry read. "Thinks I'm crazy to leave. Says I owe it to Harmony Creek to stay to fix up the farm." Another entry, dated just days before his disappearance, was more troubling. "Big fight with Sam tonight. He got really angry, angrier than I've ever seen him. Said some things about the money, about me being selfish. It was unsettling. He almost seemed desperate." There was no explicit accusation, but the entries painted a picture of escalating tension between the two friends, centered around David's decision to leave and the money involved. It contradicted Samuel's portrayal of their last interactions as only a minor disagreement. Sheriff Brody reread Samuel's initial statement. Samuel had claimed David was just vaguely packing. He hadn't mentioned a specific departure date or a major argument fueled by anger. The discrepancy was slight, but noticeable. Detectives interviewed Samuel again. He stuck to his story, dismissing the journal entries as David being overly dramatic. David was sensitive, an artist. He probably blew our argument out of proportion. We were best friends. I was sad he was thinking of leaving, sure, but angry like that? No. He seemed earnest, even hurt by the implication. Yet, something felt off. Samuel seemed more tense this time, his jovial demeanor strained at the edges. And then there was the cat. Leo, as Arthur had taken to calling him, continued his quiet haunting of the well site. He no longer cried or scratched, but he was always nearby whenever investigators were present. He'd sit on a crumbling section of the stone wall or under a nearby bush, watching. Several detectives commented on the unnerving presence of the orange cat, always watching, always silent. When Samuel visited the site with the sheriff, ostensibly to pay his respects, Leo had reportedly stared fixedly at him, letting out a low, guttural hiss before melting back into the woods, behavior no one else had elicited from the cat. Samuel had laughed it off nervously, saying the cat must be feral and spooked by the activity. Arthur, hearing this, felt another chill. He remembered the cat's focused distress before the discovery. Now, its quiet, watchful presence, especially its reaction to Samuel, felt like a silent accusation. The forensic report came back with inconclusive findings regarding the cause of death due to the advanced state of decomposition, but noted some damage to the skull that could have been caused by blunt force trauma prior to death, though a fall couldn't be ruled out entirely. It wasn't definitive proof of murder, but coupled with the journal and Samuel's slightly shifting narrative, it deepened Sheriff Brody's suspicion. He felt they were circling a truth hidden for 20 years, a truth the silent orange cat seemed determined to keep in the light. Sheriff Brody decided to press Samuel harder. He invited him down to the station for another chat, laying out the journal entries, the forensic possibilities, and the minor inconsistencies in his story more directly. He also casually mentioned the orange cat, how it had seemingly led Arthur to the well, how it remained nearby, how it had reacted specifically to Samuel. "It's strange, Sam," Brody said, watching Samuel closely. "That cat belonged to David, didn't it? Arthur seems to think so. Funny how it stuck around all these years, right near where David ended up. Almost like it knew." Samuel shifted in his chair, moisture beading on his forehead despite the cool air conditioning. "It's a coincidence, Sheriff. A stray cat hanging around an abandoned place means nothing." His voice lacked its usual confident tone. "Maybe," Brody conceded, "but David wrote about that fight, about you being angrier than he'd ever seen you, about the money." "We argued," Samuel insisted, his voice rising. "Friends argue, especially about big changes. It doesn't mean—" He trailed off, avoiding Brody's steady gaze. Brody let the silence stretch, the weight of 20 years settling in the small room. He could see the cracks forming in Samuel's carefully constructed facade. The decades of buried guilt, the shock of the discovery, the constant presence of the cat. David's cat. It was all taking its toll. "What happened that night, Sam?" Brody asked quietly, leaning forward. "The night David disappeared. The night you two argued." Samuel stared at his hands, his jaw working. He looked like a man carrying an unbearable weight. He started to shake his head, to deny it again, but then something seemed to break inside him. A choked sob escaped his lips. "It wasn't supposed to happen," he whispered, the words tumbling out, ragged and broken. "We were at the farmhouse. David was packing a bag, cash in it from selling some furniture. We argued about him leaving. I said he was throwing his life away, abandoning his home, abandoning me." Tears streamed down Samuel's face now. "He called me jealous, said I couldn't stand to see him get away while I was stuck here. We were yelling. He pushed me. I pushed him back, harder than I meant to." Samuel shuddered, covering his face with his hands. "He stumbled near the well. The cover wasn't on the right, even back then. He hit his head on the stone edge, hard. He just fell." "He fell?" Brody asked, keeping his voice level. Samuel looked up, his eyes filled with anguish and decades of fear. "He fell in. I heard the splash. I panicked, Brody. I was terrified. I looked down. He wasn't moving. I knew he was gone, and I knew how it would look. The argument, the money. People would think You killed him," Brody finished softly. "It was an accident," Samuel cried. "But I panicked. I couldn't tell anyone. I pushed the cover back over, made it look secure. I ran. I told myself he'd just run off like he planned. I tried to believe it." For 20 years, Samuel Bishop had lived with the secret, building a successful life over the foundation of a panicked lie, haunted by the memory of his best friend's fall, his own inaction. He'd watched the Palmer farmhouse decay, avoided the woods near the well, and carried the crushing weight of his guilt in silence. Sheriff Brody listened, his face grim. Whether it was an accidental fall followed by criminal negligence and concealment, or something more deliberate pushed in anger, the core truth was out. Samuel Bishop was responsible for David Palmer's death and his 20-year entombment in the well. The confession, once started, poured out of Samuel. The years of guilt, the constant fear of discovery, the way seeing the orange cat near the well recently had stirred up old terrors. He was formally arrested. The respected businessman, the lifelong resident of Harmony Creek, was charged in connection with the death of his best friend. The reckoning, delayed for 2 decades, had finally arrived. The news of Samuel Bishop's confession and arrest sent shockwaves through Harmony Creek far greater than the initial discovery of David's remains. The sense of betrayal ran deep. Samuel had been a fixture in the community, a friend, an employer. To learn that he had carried such a dark secret for so long, living amongst them while his best friend lay hidden in the cold earth, was almost incomprehensible. There was anger, sadness, and a profound sense of disillusionment. Samuel, awaiting trial, was reportedly consumed by guilt and nightmares, a broken man haunted by the face of his friend and the consequences of his panicked actions 20 years prior. Justice, however delayed, was grinding forward. A proper burial was finally arranged for David Palmer in the small cemetery behind the village church. Many townsfolk attended, paying their respects not just to the memory of the quiet, artistic boy, but also acknowledging the sad, twisted path that had finally led him home. Arthur Pendleton stood near the back, his heart heavy with a complex mix of grief for David, sorrow for the path Samuel had chosen, and a strange sense of gratitude towards the catalyst for it all. the little orange cat. A few days after the funeral, drawn by an impulse he didn't fully understand, Arthur walked back towards the old well. The police tape was gone now. The well itself looked much the same, crumbling stone, tenacious ivy. But the heavy wooden cover had been replaced by a secure metal grate, bolted down by the county. The air felt lighter. The oppressive shadow lessened somehow. Arthur looked around for Leo. He expected to see the familiar flash of orange, the silent watcher maintaining his post. But the cat wasn't there. He wasn't sitting on the wall, nor under the bushes, nor anywhere in the vicinity. Arthur walked the perimeter of the woods, calling softly, "Leo? Ginger?" But there was no response. He returned to the well and stood there for a long time, looking at the secure grate, then up at the sky filtering through the canopy of leaves. He hadn't seen Leo since the day Samuel confessed. Not around the well, not even near Arthur's own back step, where the milk saucer now remained untouched. It was as if, with the truth revealed and David finally resting in consecrated ground, the cat's long, lonely mission was complete. He had sounded the alarm. He had borne silent witness. He had stayed loyal for 20 years, bound by an instinctual tie to the place where his beloved owner had met his end. Now, perhaps, he was free. Arthur thought about the villagers' whispers, how they now spoke of the cat not as a nuisance or a stray, but as some kind of guardian spirit, David's loyal companion ensuring he wasn't forgotten. They believed Leo had guided Arthur, perhaps even nudged Samuel's conscience, playing his part until justice, however imperfect, was served. Looking at the peaceful woods, Arthur felt a sense of closure settle over him, tinged with melancholy. No one in Harmony Creek ever saw the orange cat again. Some believed he had simply wandered off, his purpose fulfilled. Others, more poetically, believed that Leo's faithful spirit had finally been released, finding peace alongside the friend he had waited for so patiently. For so long, the shadow over Whisper Creek Well had lifted, leaving behind a story of tragedy, betrayal, enduring loyalty, and the final quiet peace that comes when secrets are brought into the light.